In this video, what I want to do is ask ourselves an interesting question about beliefs within conservative thought. Now, it's a question that we're going to ask right at the start of our almost journey, going around and having a look at different beliefs and ideologies within conservatism. And it's important that we look at this before we look at different branches of conservatism and different beliefs and thoughts within conservative movements. So the question is to what extent is conservatism an ideology? Now, you might think this is quite a stupid question to ask, because we are doing a course on political ideas and political ideologies. It is situated in the mix along with socialism, anarchism, and liberalism and others, for example. So the question must surely be, yes, it is an ideology. However, over the years, a number of different political philosophers and theorists have posited this question as to whether or not conservatism is an ideology, and it can be argued for and against within the field of study. So, some have made the claim that it shouldn't be labelled as an ideology since it's not always coherent. Now, what we mean by this is conservatism as an ideology, as we know, came from a reaction to different political movements that take place. So traditional conservatism, for example, exists as a reaction to the revolutions of Europe and the American Revolution. We looked in the last lesson at Thomas Hobbes, who wasn't a conservative because conservatism didn't exist as an ideology back then, but who was almost like a founding father, who almost came up with a number of key principles that would later be developed into conservatism. He was writing during the period of the English Revolution and the English Civil War, and so was very critical and was writing as a reaction to that time period. A key thinker who we're going to be talking about in the next lesson, Edmund Burke, also writes as a reaction to both the American Revolution, who he was generally in favour of, Burke, but also the French Revolution, who Burke was incredibly opposed to. So to claim conservatism as an ideology with key principles and ideas might be misconstruing what really conservatism seeks to do, which is to react and to be established as a reaction against extreme and quite radical political change that goes on within a short period of time. As Michael Oakescott suggests, he argues that conservatism could be seen as more psychology than ideology. So we have the idea of conservatism not necessarily being an ideology because of the fact that it doesn't really necessarily reflect a number of key principles. Now, a number of people will disagree with this. Of course, this is not something that is universally accepted by everybody. But the argument being that it doesn't necessarily have any underlying principles leads to it being particularly flexible. Now, with this, we have to compare it to other ideologies. So, for example, liberalism, a number of principles within the liberal framework focus on the concept of individual freedom and individual and egotistical individualism. If you want to refresh yourself, there are a number of videos on that. Conservatism doesn't necessarily have those kind of underlying principles. At least generally, conservatism doesn't. However, we will see as we move on to look at different types of conservatism, there is the argument that there has been an attempt to try and solidify, to try and ground a number of principles into conservative thought. So, some would argue that this idea of not having very specific underlying principles and really existing as a reaction to radical political change, that actually gives it an edge over other political ideologies, because it can be seen as incredibly flexible. Okay, so it can be seen as a very flexible, and also by the extension, it can be seen as very adaptable. So it can be an adaptable kind of ideology. So with that being said, though, the counter-argument, of course, will always be to any kind of flexible position with not very many underlying principles, that critics can point to a number of inconsistencies in their beliefs. And one very good example of this that is referenced a couple of times in various textbooks and writings is that conservatives tend to support traditional institutions. So, for example, a traditional institution such as monarchy. Okay, this is generally seen as a conservative position. You tend not to have many abolitionist Republican conservatives. Not Republican as in the American political party, as in Republican as in the UK's view for removing the monarchy as the head of state. So you have support for these traditional institutions, but you also don't have support for the traditional institutions such as the trade unions and the history behind trade union movements, so labour movements as well. And again, not labour movements in terms of the name of the political party, the UK Labour Party, but labour movements as in the movement that workers' movements would probably be a better way of defining it. So labour movements. This is the problem with having political parties that are named after political movements and political ideas. You've got Republicans and you've got Labour. So anyway, they do not support institutions like trade unions and traditional movements and workers' movements, even though these also have their roots in traditionalism and traditional ideas, just like monarchy. Now, the counter argument could be that monarchy is more entrenched into culture than workers' movements, but some would definitely disagree with that. Generally speaking, though, while one may struggle to find ideology within conservatism, generally speaking, you might, from a philosophical perspective, argue that conservatism, struggles to connect with any kind of ideology. Some variations have attempted to establish principles of conservatism, and this is what we're going to look at in the next few lessons. We're going to explore the different movements within conservatism and really explore the history of conservatism as a political movement. And you will see that there are attempts to establish principles and underlying concepts within conservatism, which would lend credence to the argument that it is ideological in nature. So there are three types of conservatism that we are going to look at in the next few lessons. In the next lesson, we're going to examine the concept of traditional conservatism, the conservatism that originated from the likes of Edmund Burke, for example, and developed out of reactions to the revolutions of Europe. We're then going to look at one-nation conservatism, which is a view that is quite closely interlinked with the former Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli in the United Kingdom. And, a kind of a middle ground, early 20th century, late 19th century view of conservative thought. And then we're going to explore the features of the new right, before we then move on to look at things that we have explored before already, things like neoliberalism as a conservative ideology. Neoliberalism, and also the idea of libertarianism. Libertarianism being an ideology. Now, we've already looked at neoliberalism before, a kind of reaction to modern liberalism. We could describe neoliberalism as being, and you've also got things like libertarianism, which is a viewpoint that is, generally philosophical in nature. The concept of liberty being the center of, a number of different things. But libertarianism and libertarians today tend to align themselves more with conservative parties than they do with liberal parties. We've seen this kind of divide take place in America, for example. It's easier to see this divide within America because they've only got really a two-party system, where you've got libertarian people, libertarian thought and libertarian ideology aligning more with the GOP, with the Republican Party, than with the Democratic Party. So we're going to have a look at all these ideas in the next series of lessons. But for now, just take away from this lesson the concept of conservatism, and whenever we are examining conservatism, either as an ideology or as just generally a movement. But when we're looking at the general principles of conservatism, you have to bear in mind all the time the origins of conservatism coming out of this kind of reaction to political change, specifically to radical political change.